a subsidiary of First Quantum Minerals Limited.
Zambia's economy is highly dependent on mining and agriculture, but despite its abundant resources, growth has been insufficient to lift its young and growing population out of poverty. In the decade ending in 2021, growth averaged 3.7%, with a high volatility in mining and the weather-dependent agriculture sector. Excessive borrowing to finance inefficient public investment projects did little to boost Zambia's growth potential and exacerbated its macroeconomic imbalances. The COVID-19 pandemic hit growth even further, contributing to the country falling into debt distress, defaulting on its euro bonds in November of 2020, while also accumulating arrears to other creditors. The new dawn came into power in 2021 of August with a commitment to restoring macroeconomic stability as a precondition for sustainable growth and to focus on inclusive growth beyond traditional sectors. But with almost 3 years into government, the question is, how much has the new dawn managed to achieve in terms of investment and development? We'll discuss this and more right after this. Good evening. Welcome to Costa. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Costa Mwansa. You're watching us live on DSTV 271. It's channel 20 on GoTV, wherever you are. We're streaming live on Facebook. It's Diamond TV Zambia. On YouTube, it's Diamond TV Zambia. Jito Kayumba is Special Assistant to the President in charge of Economic Affairs and Development. He's my guest on Costa, and he joins me tonight. Jito, it's a pleasure to have you, and good evening.
I'm grateful. Thank you very much, Costa.
I think the starting point for me is really just to set an understanding in terms of how the structure of the New Dawn admin at State House sits.
Sure.
I think what traditionally has been the case is that we'll see an economic advisor, a press advisor, a legal advisor, and by and large these are people that are just whispering to the head of state, their background men and women. You seemingly as a New Dawn have a new way of doing things. Your position, first of all, is not really economic advisor. We do have an economic advisor in there.
That's correct.
Some see you sometimes doing what they may term project management or implementation, communication on behalf of the president. What really is your role? And just break down the structure of this current establishment.
No, I appreciate that question, Costa, and I think it's important to really shed light and really in line with the president's vision and the manner in which he wants to govern, and that which is, he wants to do it effectively. Now, the fact of the matter is, the president has an economic advisor or special assistant to the president for economic affairs, and her name is Dr. Pamela Nakamba, who's extraordinarily competent in her role, having a strong background in economics. I, on the other hand, am special assistant to the president for finance and investment. So it's a separate role. We work very well together. She's very strong from a fiscal policy, a macroeconomic policy perspective, preparing the president from a, really appreciating all the drivers across the economy, right? There's all the economic factors and keeping him briefed in that particular area. My end is more on the application of economic matters. We're talking execution of investments. The world of finance is somewhat different. It's part of the economic field, but it's one where there's there's a lot of work that goes into how do you trigger foreign direct investment, local investment, how do you accumulate capital, how do you execute a project, how do you negotiate a deal that yields economic value. It's about what moves the economic needle, what gets GDP to grow. That's the active approach from an investment standpoint in which I'm involved in. And the president saw it fit to create these two roles to ensure that his economic platform is enhanced. He sees this presidency truly as an economic presidency, because part of the expectations of the Zambian people as he came into office is that they want to see economic change. They want to see effective implementation of what gets people out of poverty. So hence the support system had to be enhanced. And to address the point of my visibility being a communicator, you may notice that a lot of my communication is actually very specific towards my role. So I'm not a spokesperson for the president or a press aide. I'm somebody who stays within the investment and finance realm, but I'm able to share, the great work the president is doing through the platform of my office, and that's ultimately what people see.
Based on that, and again, just to set the record straight where others feel there might be an overstep, when you say it's about negotiating and so on, are you not overstepping into areas such as ZDA or the Ministry of Commerce? The president's role is to be in charge of the executive now. Is the presidency negotiating deals on behalf of the country? Is that what you're saying?
It's a collaborative effort. We see government as one system. It's a one government policy. I'm very attached to ZDA. We work very well together. Mr. Wampa, highly competent gentleman who is overseeing aspects of FDI, managing the process of investor relations on behalf of the entire government. But one thing people have to recognize about the power of the president we have in terms of his ability to draw investments in, being a highly credible, highly competent individual that he is, he has a way in which he communicates with investors. Now, his engagement with investors requires a degree of assistance in terms of mitigating or managing the relationship and bringing that into the government system. That's part of what we do. So it's not a situation where I alone am involved in a negotiation. It's really a matter of ensuring that the president's vision and what he wants out of a specific transaction, given the prowess and competence he has, is brought together, and I help bring alignment. And that's ultimately what a press aide is supposed to do.
There are concerns, Mr. Kayumba, really. Of course, the president having that, capability and background coming from a business world, you yourself coming from an investment background. Sure. But you've heard concerns that what you're running are not your personal businesses. This is a country. Absolutely. And people are complaining of the transparency of the nature of these negotiations that you're engaging into. The word is you are mortgaging the country. How transparent are you in terms of some of these investments that are coming into the country? Should there be need for concern? Is there should there be need for us to get concerned with the concerns being raised?
Well, those concerns are unfounded because of the fact that there's a lot of transparency, there's a lot of cooperation. The president sets up committees. So, for example, in all mining transactions, there's a council of ministers who are roughly 5 or 6 in total. I forgot the exact number, involving Ministry of Finance, of Mines, of Justice, Technology, Infrastructure. They're all involved in being part of this. They are also essentially deputized, or there's a committee of technical experts that sit in the line ministries that oversee these processes, including the asset holders being ZCCMIH. So it's a highly inclusive, highly transparent process. Now, of course, people have to be proud of the fact that we have a president whose background is one that, his level of competence is so high that he's able to oversee and ensure that the right tools are in place for us to get the best deals. There's a reason why this country got probably the best economic benefit out of a recent transaction with Mopani, for example. People often wonder, most people who understand finance, when they look at valuation, one has to look at what percentage do you derive subject to or depending on the amount of capital you put into the transaction. We got 49% for not having putting any capital. Yes, we had ownership in the asset, but the asset also had $1.7 billion in debt. So all of that coming together, and from a technical standpoint, people saw that this truly came about as a result of what we call presidential goodwill, and not only his credibility, his expertise, but ultimately it's being able to pull together all these experts, which includes ministers and the stakeholders I mentioned, and getting the best deal for the country. And now you've got a mine that's being capitalized, that's ultimately going to transform the lives of people briefly around the rest of the Copper Belt?
Well, one thing, we cannot run away from is that, yes, as much as we want to compete globally on the international stage for investment and really boost our economy, there's geopolitics at play.
Absolutely.
And the finger pointing has always been that this government is more pro-West, and we saw so much of the likes of China's involvement in the last decade with a lot of infrastructure development and so on. I know the president has tried to explain this, but why do we see ourselves having this direction of being so pro-West?
So there's nothing that could truly suggest that that's the case, and I can give you the evidence. First and foremost, the first trip the president took when he took office was to go to New York City, where that is essentially the host city for the United Nations. At that platform, other leaders from across the world show up, including China. Now, the fact is, and we appreciate the fact that not only did he go to the U.S., but he also got to engage with U.S. stakeholders, but under the auspices or the platform of the United Nations. Beyond that is multiple engagements with multiple countries, whether it be in the EU and other places. But also what's important is the fact that he has been engaging very actively with China, among other countries. I mean, he's been there, and you could see the results that came out of that trip and the amount of engagement that this government is having with China. I think what's important, before I dive into the various relationships that we have internationally and looking at the geopolitical landscape, one thing you have to recognize the fact that Zambians, as a government institution, if you will, from history, has always been non-aligned, and we're following that same foreign policy from the time of Kenneth Kaunda. And with that being said, we work with anyone who's willing to work with us for the betterment of the Zambian people.
But when you say you're going to give evidence, Mr. Kayumba, roughly when we see projects based on capacity and based on what we see across the world, it seems that you have more preference for Western aligned investment.
Let's count the investments. Take, for example, the trip to China resulted in CNMC, one of the largest mining groups over there, essentially doubling down on the investments in Zambia. Luanshya mine, for 23 years, Luanshya mine has been defunct. The town of Luanshya has suffered economically as a result of failure to unlock that investment. Now it's being dewatered. $500 million is being invested. Where's that money coming from? It's coming from China. It came about because of an engagement the president had with his counterpart in China. Beyond that, the interaction with the shareholders, the investors, the directors in Beijing also resulted in that. Beyond that, NFCA mine, which is also under the same group in Kalushi, is being expanded as well. I visited them recently. Beyond that, you've got expansions across the board within the same CNMC group, including Chambishi Copper Smelter. And now, with that being said, that's very significant. You're talking over $1 billion of new investments.
But would that match the other investments elsewhere? You
Absolutely.
talk about Mingomba, you talk about what's happening in energy, you talk about what's happening in Northwestern Province. Where is all this concern coming from?
There should be no concern. At the end of the day, Zambians should be excited that it benefits all of us. The fact is, I love what Deng Xiaoping, the president of China, I think he was the second or so president of China, and his statement was that we don't care whether a cat is white or black as long as it catches mice. The fact of the matter is, capital from China is as good as capital from the US and from the EU and from other places. We're getting investment that is significant from China, and more is coming. And on top of that, not only did the president go to China in September, he's going back for FOCAC, which is a conference where China essentially meets with African leaders. And of course, to continue to enhance our investments. Let me also touch on the fact that Tazara is being revamped because the group that built that particular rail line are coming back. Then on top of that, we had Power China, who came just last week, committing massive investment, not only in the agricultural sector, in the water sector, and also in the power sector. So really the magnitude of investment coming from there is huge. And it's nothing, and we're not here to compare who's better than the other. We're getting investment from the UAE. This is a new relationship because we've never had a large large-scale investment from United Arab Emirates. But now it's happening. We can't say, no, we now prefer the Middle East over the EU. The EU have continued to be supportive from a government-to-government perspective, and same thing with the US. We're happy that we've strengthened and revamped our relationship with the US. All of this pulls in the magnitude of resources that ultimately should bring about economic value for the citizens of this country. I think what's important is there's a direct benefit.
Let's talk about the UAE and Abu Dhabi in itself, and back to the Mopani deal that you touched on. Obviously, at the time of renegotiating, ZCCMIH had taken full ownership with a debt of around $1.7 billion being owed to Glencore.
That's correct.
Let's set the record straight, because Zambians have not really been given the 100% picture of this transaction. This administration refuses to say this was not a sale.
No, it wasn't.
And again, I want to be very basic for the sake of us uneducated laymen and viewers, in that, I mean, once you transfer shares of an asset, it's a sale. What do you call it? So why do we refuse to call this a sale? If not a sale, what is it? Is it a joint venture? And then again, there are question marks raised around this sale in terms of some Black Mountain slag being given to the Arabs in this whole transaction, their lack of expertise in mining and so on. Break this Mopani deal down for us, and let's start from, what is it if it's not a sale?
So essentially, let me start off with an analogy, if you may allow me. Imagine you've got a bucket of water. You've got a field that you need to irrigate, and you need 100 liters to irrigate the field. You only have, say, 49 liters. Now imagine going to somebody and says, add in 51 liters to make it 100 so that we can eventually irrigate. So you now have a complete package of irrigation, if you will, to be able to essentially do what you need to do from an agricultural standpoint. So I'm using that example as that this is an enhancement of what we already had. We have an asset, which is Mopani, an asset that was severely indebted, given what's transpired with Glencore, which, you know, everyone knows who understands the Glencore transaction.
But just there with the analogy you give, Jito, what the Zambians argue is that whichever mine, and in particular Mopani, we own these resources 100%.
Yes, but
the fact, yes, is when Glencore exited, we had to pay them back. So we own 100% of this mine, yet we're owing Glencore. So how did we arrive at the 51-49?
In fact, that was expertly negotiated with the guidance of the president. The fact of the matter is, we owed 100% of something that was actually negative. So if anything, we were in a much lesser position. When you owe $1.7 billion, though the asset wasn't even generating sufficient economic value to even run.
Did we evaluate the asset to know that it was not able to pay back $1.7 billion?
It was operating, and not only was it operating, all those factors were put in place, all those valuations were done. The fact of the matter is, it did not have the ability to generate the kind of cash based on the lack of investment. We found very weak fiscal space when this government came in, and not only that, the mine itself did not have the financial muscle to...
Obviously, what we're told is Mopani needed an equity partner.
It absolutely needed an equity partner to come on board with the cash, because the funding is not, if it were available locally, that would be a fantastic way to move forward. And what's great about the transactions that they've retained a significant number of Zambian staff, essentially led by Mr. Charles Sakanya, who's the CEO. On top of that, they've added the capital needed to now start to sink new shafts, to now start to build a concentrator, to now start to pay off retirees and all the people who were indebted to, and also suppliers and the like. And you see a growth right now that's taking place, and the rejuvenation of Kitwe and Mufulira. And of course, you touched on slag dumps. Those dumps were owned by Mopani, because ultimately this is a result of waste product from the processing of the metal. So all of that sits within the asset, and of course that's all part of the package, and all that will be reprocessed so that they can derive economic value. The beauty is that we are shareholders, so we will directly have access to the value of it, and already the productivity has started to rise. We found it, in fact, last year the Mopani closed at about 64,000 metric tons, when the mine has a potential to hit 230,000 100,000 metric tons. So from a value perspective, we've unlocked something that would ultimately create enormous economic value.
So what is wrong then, Mr. Kayumba, to basically say IRH has come in with $600 million,
Sure.
that is equivalent to 51% of equity or shares. So we've sold them 51% stake in the mine for $600 million.
New shares were issued. Essentially, when new shares are issued, and then they get subscribed to. So if anything, we weren't reduced in any particular way. Of course, comparatively speaking, one has to always think, when you think of investments, think of the value of what you own. A lot of people like to think of the idea, the pride of owning 100%, but 100% of something very tiny that doesn't even pay you. But I would rather own 50% of something massive that will feed this country for generations, that will improve the living standards of people in Mufulira and Kitwe. I've physically been there myself, and I'm so proud to see what this transaction has done, the manner in which it's changing people's lives. And the beginning, and this is only just the beginning, the investor's only been on board for the last 3 months.
The other interesting thing, based on who was involved in negotiating this, is we owed Glencore,
that's right,
$1.7 billion. They left, obviously, after operating this mine for years. They had just commissioned a new synclinorium and done some good upgrade works for the money they were asking. They know the output of copper, the lifespan of the mine, and of course the pricing of copper. How then do we say that out of $1.7 billion, they have settled to only accept that they be paid back that $600 million?
The fact of the matter is, this is why we love that transaction. It was well negotiated. We were able to bring them down, as we're doing with most transactions that have crippled this country. Even when you look at the debt situation of the country, we look at restructuring. This is part of the restructure that the president's been driving at. The only way we can unlock the future in terms of driving the economy towards prosperity, one has to look at the magnitude of debt that we sit with and be able to engage the investors, or the creditors that we owe money to, and get them to agree to terms that allows for us to now have a future. Because us being lumped to that amount, of course, there's multiple technicalities I don't want to get too deep into. Like, for example, the time value of money. If you pay a certain amount up front, as opposed to waiting for the time to elapse, of course, that also reduces the sum that you essentially have to pay. You can now sort of quantify a much smaller amount. And, of course, leveraging on the fact that we were unhappy. I don't want to say anything that crosses the bounds of my role, of course, going into...
But the question is, for the sake of transparency, obviously it goes beyond just the fact that they've settled for us. Is there nothing else that we've leveraged on or they've asked for?
That's it. So we clear them. Now everything, the output, they had 80% of offtake. And mind you, in fact, something I need to mention.
Because there was a 10-year deal, I believe,
yes,
or caveat, that they would be getting a percentage out of output for the next 10 years.
Exactly.
Has that been done away with?
It's done away. It's gone. We own everything out of the output of Mopani. Now, this is the most important part when it comes to why we're excited about the future of the mining sector in Zambia. It's the fact that now we have control of the actual resource. Many people, when they look at mining, and Zambians know this, for the last 60 years, we've felt shortchanged when it comes to the mining industry, the extent of value we derive from it. It's not just about shareholding. Shareholding is one thing, but as a shareholder, tricks can be played, transfer pricing and so on. We're glad that ZRA are doing things to avoid, or to at least manage and mitigate transfer pricing. But the most important component of mining is the actual product. It's what happens once the metal is produced, or once you have that cathode. And being able to control the marketing of it is very important. This is why you see a policy shift, and Cabinet announced this a couple of months ago, to essentially now start to be involved in that aspect. So our exposure to that is extremely important with regards to the long-term trajectory of our benefits in the mining sector.
Let's still, hammer on this Mopani deal. So $600 million is brought in as investment for 51% of shares, but this is the same money we've paid back to Glencore, and then the question arises that IRH is also paying off some of ZCCMIH's or Mopani's, let me just say Mopani's liability, retirees and suppliers and contractors. Yes. How much then, Mr. Kayumba, has been pumped into in terms of investment? Because I know that Mopani needed a financial boost.
That's right. I need to correct something. The total package was $1.1 billion. Just over 400 million of that went to Glencore. The 620 stayed here in Zambia. In fact, they're working what they call a PDP. That's a project development plan, which essentially now, first of all, starts to amortize all the liabilities, take care of, including the city council. Kitwe is receiving more money from levies from Mopani than it's ever received in a long time, and they're quite pleased with that. Now, beyond that, and hiring, for example, there's a lot of money going into hiring. Just 400 were employed in the last week. We're talking general workers and the like. And there's more to happen, and the plans around sinking the new shafts, ensuring that the shafts that were sunk by Glencore are optimized, because it's not optimal. Because Glencore, and you stated something earlier about them not having a background in mining and so on. You know, the beauty of having sufficient capital is that you can employ expertise. If I decided to start a TV station, you've got a fantastic TV station tomorrow, though I'm not a media expert, but I decided to get Jonah, get Vida, get all your great people here, I could pull it off, right? And somebody who's smart enough, obviously, you're hard to employ because you are the chief visionary officer here. But having a guy like Costa run your TV station, you know that you're going to run a great TV station. That's what this particular mine did. They went and picked the best of the best around the world as IRH, from Rio Tinto, from Barrick and so on, to now lead their charge into the mining sector. So expertise can be acquired through, of course, you have to be strategic about it. I thought I should mention that. But to really conclude the point around the application of capital in Mopani is that we're talking about the unfolding of $620 million directly in Mopani. This money has been hitting the accounts. And beyond that, sinking new shafts is not cheap. Acquiring new equipment, all of that is not cheap. And that is what is essentially going to happen.
Yeah. So as we move away from this issue, guide me on how these negotiations are happening between our government and private investors.
Sure.
Who facilitates? Because again, there's all these issues arising, that you are sent to facilitate these things on behalf of the president, sometimes as an individual. No. And obviously, the way these contracts are designed is that you are now working in the presidency, but fostering a personal business ambition to get all these facilitation fees and how these things. Explain to us how do these negotiations work on behalf of our government and private investors, such as IRH?
One thing that we have to do as a country is that we have to stay away from innuendo and be practical. And the other thing is, there's a lot of rumor mongering out there about everything. Anything and everything has rumors associated with it. When we stay on the actual subject and understand the factors associated, I also look at it from a degree of ignorance of some, or even deliberate ignorance in terms of politicizing something that's actually good. And within the political realm, you've got so many voices who've made a deliberate decision that this government has to fail, whether it be debt restructuring, whether it be getting Mopani going, or KCM, or getting Luansha going. There's a celebration when we struggle to get through, but when we make it, they have to now flip the script and say, no, it was acquired in an erroneous manner. The fact of the matter is, the president has a team, a wide team, not just an individual like myself. I'm here representing, basically the team to explain to you what's going on. But I'm one of many. And we sit in these discussions, we manage relationships. The first secret to unlocking transactions is that you have to have a relationship. You cannot do a transaction where the person doesn't have faith or trust in you, or feel that they have a rapport where you can understand how you structure it. That's on one hand. The other hand is making sure you've got the legal aspects in place. The other hand is the financial aspects, it's technical. It also requires us to leverage on institutions like the Attorney General's office. We can't sign any agreement without approval through the Ministry of Justice. Of course, the technical insights that comes from the various government departments, including the shareholders who work with us, like ZCMIH, for example, who are shareholders on our behalf in these entities. It's impossible for one to do it by themselves.
Is it true that in all these negotiations, ZCCMIH feels, left out, that State House has taken over their job, hence even the fallout with the former MD?
No. That's not true. I think, this is just going back to innuendo. They're all involved in it. It's impossible for the board and the management team not to be involved. They have to be. They're very much hands-on in it, because ultimately they are our custodians on behalf. State House is ultimately, when a president is elected into office by millions of Zambians to carry a mandate to deliver. So he provides leadership, and he assembles teams. So we all have to play a role one way or the other, and we have to be aggressive about it. And this is something, if you just think about the history of Zambia, think about where we are. If you compare just two countries, for example, just to really shed light and create some context, look at where Korea was and where we are at 1964, and where they are today versus us. They are a $1.7 trillion economy. We're just roughly under $30 billion. There's a different mindset we need to have, and this is all speaks to the difference in the manner in which we operate. You talk about visibility of presidential advisors and so on. All of this is part of the change that needs to take place in order for this country to really move.
But what I understand you're saying is that this current president has taken it upon himself to have an economic drive where he is in the lead himself to speak to investors, attract investors, and bring them.
The reality is, he is, for lack of a better word...
Most ministers call him the chief negotiator. Is the president himself negotiating these deals?
He's the chief marketing officer. He is the most attractive component we have. You and I can be proud of the fact that we've got a president who, when he sits in front of President Xi Jinping, he will unlock a deal. He will get Luansha unlocked. If he sits in front of Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan in the UAE, he will get a transaction unlocked. When he sits across President Biden, he gets transactions unlocked. There's a manner in which he engages, which opens the door for the rest of the government system to work through. I, for one, for example, can clearly state that my job is so much easier because of the fact that he has created that goodwill. He has elevated the reputation of this country as an investment destination. So once we go in to do the technical work, it's so easy. Everybody's just ready for the transaction to close. So that's the role he plays, and he builds consensus.
The president has been criticized for his globe-trotting, they call it. He travels too much at the expense of the taxpayers' cost and money at a time where this government is calling for austerity measures, at a time where we are asking for a supplementary budget. And 2 years ago, this administration said whenever we go out for a trip, we'll always come back and brief you. This has stopped, Jito. We no longer see these updates of where the president... So how do we justify the benefits of the presidential trips? I think the latest one being that the president wasted taxpayers' money by going to collect a doctorate.
No, not at all. What happened was, do you know that when he went to the UK, actually was able to unlock funding not only for a contribution to Lubito Corridor, but also for our drought efforts. The amount of funding he gets, and on top of that, when was the last time a Zambian president went and met the King of England? It's a big deal. The representation that our country has is extraordinary.
At the expense when you have a deficit and a drought? Should we be celebrating just to have tea with the King?
Not at all. In fact, if anything, let's also remember the symbolism of certain things. When the optics of that unlock so much more, you're taken more seriously. You and I, when we do business in this world that we live in, life and business, there's a reason why, for example, you're wearing a fantastic jacket. That's also part of the optics of us taking you seriously as a businessman, as a person within the media space. The same thing as a head of state, when you interact with somebody at a level of the ruler, if you will, or the monarch of a country who has significant impact or even reputation in the global scheme of things, you actually do get a lot of goodwill. Beyond that, he did unlock funding. I think I need to get the specific number. It must have been about $30 or so million, which is going towards, I think on one hand, on one hand there's a Lubito Corridor contribution. Secondly, there's also contribution to the drought. So him going there actually brought back more value than the cost of traveling. You see, the cost of travel is really just a minuscule element when you compare the benefits. We talked about the trip to China, the billions of dollars it's bringing in for Tazara, for the mining sector. The trip to the US, unlocking the Millennium Challenge account. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. Support from USAID, support from so many other mechanisms that get the Zambian people to benefit.
Does it always have to be the president? Because when a president travels, obviously there's security detail, there's advance party and all that. These things cannot be done by permanent secretaries, by directors within ministry. Why then do we have a assistant. Does it always have to be the presidency to travel?
There are times it is absolutely necessary because of the people he's also engaging. These are people at the highest level. So one has to respect the fact that there's a counterpart exchange. Beyond that...
But it's not always when he's meeting presidents. We've seen some of these side meetings. You're meeting basically CEOs and things like that. So should it be the president meeting a CEO of a private company?
Can I tell you one sad reality about us? You see, we have to be humble about this reality. We are in a very bad situation. Even when I look at the last 60 years, right? Our GDP level. A country of Zambia, say, has, we teeter around getting, there's an argument around where we sit. Say we're at $27 billion in GDP. You meet a company whose balance sheet is $100 billion. A president of a country of a $30 billion economy meeting a $100 billion investment, who will change the fortunes of a town in Zambia like Luansha? That is necessary. And people at that level typically don't want to meet with the PS or even myself or anybody else. They want to meet with the president. Let me also add another very important point, is the fact that, the debt restructure, the success, the incredible success. We've broken a historical record. People at business schools and economists, they'll be studying this for years to come. The fact that we were able to come out the gate, get the IMF staff level agreement in the time that we got, of course get the package. Beyond that, restructuring the debt, dealing with the bondholders and so on, all of that required presidential engagement because Zambia had truly lost its credibility. Because we were saddled with so much debt, for you to now get this combination of bondholders, combination of, whether it be Paris Club, London Club, investors, creditors, if you will, to agree to consent to a haircut so that we can now have the fiscal space that we need to develop this country. That required a presidential intervention.
Are we out of the woods yet? Yes, it's a commendable thing, but others caution that we shouldn't celebrate moving debt, forward. That's one. Two, that this is not the full amount of the debt that we've restructured. We're talking only $6.3 billion out of this debt. And again, Zambia, out of the COVID-19 pandemic, is being used as a case study, or rather a guinea pig, as they would call it, for the G20 framework. We're the first on this IMF or Paris Club, program. So universities are studying us for the aspect of, will this be a success in terms of the IMF restructure? So is there a need for us to celebrate yet? Are we out of the woods?
We have every reason to celebrate. We've come so far. There's already consent on the part of the bondholders. We've already reached closure on the fact of the official creditors. The fact of the matter is, yes, there's some technicalities that need to come into play, but we're essentially out of the woods. The beauty is, the fiscal space that's unlocked from the fact that, imagine today, say you have an individual, his income is 5,000 kwacha. He owes something like, 100,000 kwacha, and then is told eventually that, and you have to pay it, by the way, next year. Then someone comes and restructures and says, instead of paying 100,000, you pay 20,000, but you pay it over the next 20 years.
Are we out of the woods?
We are out of the woods, and we are essentially, of course, everything is, I have to qualify that statement by saying that the hardest part has been dealt with. Now it's the technicalities to resolve. It's minor pieces in order for us to close.
For the sake of time, Jito, let me still go back to mining, but I would want us to talk about just the mining sector. You've been attending, the mining indaba in South Africa.
That's right.
Another big one is coming for Zambia, and we're being looked at, especially as we look towards a greener future and issues of EV batteries and so on. Having deposits, I think it's only Zambia and Congo with the world's largest, deposits. There've been investments, but let's begin to break it down in the fact that if we do not unlock the mining potential, our exchange rate will never stabilize. Our export spreadsheet will not be healthy. It's currently unhealthy. Mopani is beginning to look up. Shaft 28 is beginning to look up. We still have bottlenecks or choking points at KCM. The court approved the scheme, the creditor scheme. Those owed were expecting that they should have been paid by, I think, Friday last week, the 12th of July. We're hearing that the monies haven't moved yet. What are the problems from your end? You've been on the ground with KCM, Vidanta, and really getting the mine back on its wheels?
Well, first of all, I want to touch on just the mining sector as a whole. You know, we couldn't be more excited about the future of the mining sector, and the proof is in the pudding. It's in the proof is also in the processes and the outcomes of a lot of the engagements you've had and the unlocking of funding. Not only from a Luanshya perspective, from Luanshya Copper Mine, NFCA, CCS, you've got greenfields like Kayumba who are very fast on track, and they'll be making announcements very soon. That's very exciting. The expansions taking place at Kansanshi, the expansions taking place at Lumwana. We've obviously got the rejuvenation of Mopani, and there are many others that we've not even spoken about, but are in the works, and I'll save them for now. And of course, now you closed on KCM. KCM obviously has been undergoing a number of challenges, including the provisional liquidation, and then of course that element is meant to come to an end following the court process that's been undergone in relation to the scheme of arrangements. That adjudication happened, and we expect movement. Now there are some interactions. Some of them are completely confidential. We can't disclose the public in terms of the interactions that the Ministry of Justice, the liquidator, KCM, Vidanta, and all the parties are arriving at. But we are expecting closure within the next few days. And that closure will essentially lead to $250 million paid to creditors, and then also the unlocking of funding to develop the mine, which includes the Konkola Deep, which is really a prized asset, which will contribute to a significant amount of output. And like you rightfully stated, over 75% or so of our export earnings comes from copper. So if we enhance, which we will, enhance the output, we'll get to a point where the stability from the Kwacha perspective will be there, because we'll have sufficient inflows.
The president has made it extremely clear that he doesn't want to do business within the courts of law. He would rather settle out of court and negotiate, and probably feels that it is time efficient. It is also less costly to negotiate with Vidanta in a boardroom rather than in the court. But on the flip side, Vidanta had really lost out on the social capital of the Zambian people, of the mining community in Chingola and Chilawombwe. They've also been making a bit of bad headlines in terms of the environmental compliance, but also in terms of just their financial position. Are we happy, and have we done a proper due diligence that the Vedanta we're taking on has the liquid to uphold their pledge and investments? Because part of the loss of the social capital was that they didn't plow back into KDMP with what they promised.
There is absolutely no doubt that the social license was lost. There was a lot of anger on the part of the residents of Chilawombwe and Chingola. There's no doubt about that. And the apprehension around them coming back is very real. But the fact of the matter is there was no other choice. There was no other option. They were far more, superior to our position legally. When we were taken to court for having done what was done, which was done erroneously, the president, I think, has been on record since before he became president, the manner in which the liquidation process came into place. Now, the fact is, because of the botched effort to get them out, which was, the intention was on the track in line with what the people felt, the lack of the social contract. But the fact of the matter is, they needed to be re-engaged as the legitimate shareholders. But you also have to remember the message this sends to any investor who wants to be in an environment where there's an appreciation for the rule of law. And that appreciation is recognizing that you can't misappropriate an asset. Part of what enhances FDI in any country and creates a high degree of confidence is knowing that when I acquire an asset, I actually have a legitimate claim on it, and if I go to court, it will go the right way.
What safeguards have been put in place? Because we cannot be comfortable just with an assurance, a political assurance to say the Vedanta of UPND will be different from the Vedanta of PF.
For two reasons. Number one,
what safeguards have we put in place?
They are being supervised by a credible, a competent government which understands matters relating to the transaction. But two is that the team who've been negotiating this have ensured they've embedded clauses in the agreement, in the development agreement, that essentially puts in place a certain, it penalizes them, to put it simply, that if they do not fulfill those obligations, they will lose out in a very significant way. I can't express openly what those clauses say, but the fact of the matter is we do have a provision where that asset can be taken back by the Zambian people in a legitimate way where they can't even challenge it. So they know that they can't mess up, for lack of a better word.
So we've got those covers within the contract.
We do.
Let's talk about still the aspect of mining with what I touched on. Zambia sits in a very advantageous situation going into the future, especially with lithium, cobalt and nickel demand for clean energy and so on. How are we positioning ourselves? Yes, we have the raw material, we have the resource, but I think for the longest, and I know you're an advocate, this is your line of work in your private space, is to raise capital and investment.
Correct.
My bit of a problem on FDI is that it leaves then just the Zambian a worker. When do we begin to transform, Jito, Zambians into billionaires, into owners, but also into participation beyond the worker? That we can own the tech, we can own the factories, we can own the warehouses, or is it just that the foreigners will bring in the money, they'll bring in the tech, and all we clap over is that hundreds or thousands of jobs have been created?
It's an excellent point you've raised, and it's a point that we're very alive to. It's a point that the president is very alive to, and one of the fundamental points that he brings across when it comes to new transactions is that, number one, we have to have enhanced shareholding. Empowerment starts with shareholding. You need to have a piece of the action when it comes to when the profits or the value is derived. You need to get or
to be able to sit at the table to make the decisions.
You must be a director. You must be a shareholder. Yes, and you must be a person in the C-suite, talking CEO, CFO, something along those lines, beyond the general working space. That is 100% guaranteed, or in terms of, when I say guaranteed, but it's the way it should be. But let me just make a clear point in terms of what will take us there. Let's look at history first. Let's look at the last 60 years. How have things been any better or any worse from a Zambian ownership perspective? The government has tried, of course, to own the means of production in many instances, and that, for a reason or whatever, did not work out. We want to now enhance and build the private sector. Another thing the president has been doing is saying that whenever a new investor comes in, enter a joint venture with the Zambian. This is something he makes very clear. That's one, to enhance capacity, to enhance skills development. But the other thing I often talk about is the fact that we need to enhance our capital ecosystem. This includes, we have to ask ourselves, where does capital come from? Where does FDI come from? Both FDI as well as local capital is an accumulation of savings. When we bring in FDI, we're essentially importing savings that somebody else put aside in another market. What we need to do, if we want to be stronger participants in any industry, is that we need to get better at accumulating capital locally. Domestic resource mobilization. We're talking accumulating funds in the pension funds.
But I'm happy you bring that point, because I have followed both yourself and the president speak at many a forum, urging the banks and all these lenders, Jito, to bring down the cost of money. But you'll admit, and I was speaking to the finance minister just last week on this particular program, that unfortunately the cost of money in this country and just the way the system is laced is an impediment to local investment and just us local business people.
That's true, but the same ecosystem also has foreign business people who actually borrow at the same borrowing rates.
No, they don't, Jito, because they are not borrowing from the local banks.
No, I'm talking about the ones in the local ecosystem. Let me give you an example. Let's have one thing I always like to share with people is that it's important that we as Zambians, particularly indigenous Zambians, and I dare say black Zambians, we need to be more honest with each other on our, of course, we're wonderful people. We're kind, we're accommodating, but there's aspects about our culture that actually limits us in our exposure to certain industries. There's a reason why we get overrun by people of other communities. And by the way, I need to make this very important disclaimer, is that we never want a situation where Zambians get to a point where they're xenophobic in any way. But the fact of the matter is, for the last 60 years, you've had dominance on the part of industry from people who are not of a indigenous Zambian orientation. That tells you something about the fact that we need to start addressing, charity begins at home. What are we teaching our children? What are we essentially doing with each other in terms of how do we develop our capacity to be significant players in businesses?
But that is exactly my point, Jito, where I ask, what are you doing to empower Zambians to make them, billionaires or millionaires, where you sit on a resource? You give very good examples, Singapore, Malaysia, China. Granted, no country develops without foreign investment and foreign. We live in a global ecosystem.
Absolutely.
But taking the ownership and having locals participate, at least even on 60-40 or on the 50-50, whether in mining, very few locals are captains of those industries. Whether it's in agriculture, sadly, even
Kayumbas in our communities. Let me say this. I'm sorry.
The finance minister, was giving that example of Rwanda. So where are we getting it wrong?
That's what I'm saying. Is that if we're being defeated, if you will, for lack of a better word, in the large-scale industries, but we're also being defeated, or there's others dominating our Kayumbas in our communities, it means fundamentally.
Is it a policy that is wrong, or the mindset?
It's a combination of all. You have to remember, where does policy come from? Where do leaders come from? We all come from the community. We all come from the same culture. Charity begins at home. We have to start to evaluate how are we existing within our communities? How are we engaging as Zambians at really just family level? What are we doing in terms of inculcating, instilling the mindset, the skill sets towards now being able to be competitive so that we can be significant business owners? Because I'll give you an example. You find an Indian community in the UK who started little corner shops, now have taken over one of the biggest UK sort of grocers, which is Tesco, or a small enterprise has taken over another large industry. So the point I'm trying to make is everything that we want to achieve at a high level, we're not even achieving at a small level, from a home level. So we have to evaluate how we do this. But let me explain how we're intervening. We're enhancing the availability of capital to people at all levels. You talk about CDF. There's a lot that people can say, no, it's, we haven't yet touched a bit of that action. But the fact of the matter is 30 million kwacha is extremely significant compared to 1.6 million kwacha, which was going to each constituency. Now, the magnitude of that is accruing to local communities. That is empowering people with more resources than never had before. Let me close with this last point. CEC, it's a huge pain point for a lot of Zambians who say they're not accessing. But let me tell you one truth that many do not admit. CEC, first and foremost, is funding more Zambians than ever before. The institution started in 2008. If you look at the average disbursement on an annual basis, you're talking 20 to 30 million kwacha per year. In the last 2 years, each year, this year I think it's about 350 million, the year before it's about 400 million kwacha. Now if you combine just the last 2 years of this new Dawn administration, it is more money dispersed to support Zambians than the last 15 or so years combined from CEC. So the answer to that point is that there's more Zambians benefiting than ever before, but we have a gap. We have a 30 billion kwacha gap because the number of applications towards CEC, which essentially get approved, are in the billions, that reach 30 billion. But there's only 300 or so million available to disperse on an annual basis.
Which brings me to the point to say if we've got a 30 billion gap, that's an opportunity for the commercial banks to tap in. And you spoke about the pension funds as where does capital come from.
Correct.
You've got now NAPSA, workers' compensation, sitting on lots of money. But sometimes the investments that they pump into are laughable. We're putting these things into just shopping malls and hotels, whether they bring the value or not, or these are things of abuse. Are we investing into the correct project?
We're on the same page on that point, but the beauty is that NAPSA has been revising its investment strategies, ensuring that it also has SME exposure. There's a process underway. They'll have an opportunity to announce what's going on. We're also working with the banks, telling them that there's this gap. And most recently, I've been interacting with the banking sector, with the chief executives, to basically talk about this funding gap, so that the expectation of Zambians is that it's not that CEC alone can be the answer to their problems, it's also the fact that there's other financial institutions. But the other point I need to raise, which is very important, it's always the elephant in the room, it's uncomfortable to say, but we as Zambians have to also step up and be more aggressive.
To repay the loans. But I know there's default, and the high cost of money is also around just commercial banks. Sadly, most of these banks are foreign. Where in this bigger picture of us developing and taking advantage of these opportunities, where, for example, is Development Bank of Zambia? Because these are the engines that are supposed to be giving, people cheaper money, locals, and directly sort of working into areas of agriculture, energy, where all these opportunities are.
We need a system that definitely enhances the capacity of entrepreneurs. You see, even when financial institutions are there, DBZ is technically defunct right now. It has to be, there's a process around getting that back on track. But the reality is the ecosystem of SME financing and so on is is it's multifaceted. So I'll touch on this one point. We also need to just have a competent business community who understands corporate governance, who also understands financial management, understands the payback period, structuring, budgeting. That's very important. There's a reason that the president created the Ministry of SME Development, is to ensure that those skill sets are put in place. Of course, it's still very much in its infancy, though it's been about close to 3 years thereabout. But there's been a lot of successes that one can speak of. The trouble we have, to be frank, is that not many people speak of the wins. People become afraid of the resentment that arises when somebody discloses that they've done well. Because we've seen it ourselves, the pulling down syndrome. The fact is, we need a balance of government has a role to play, the people have a role to play as well. And we also have to ensure that together we enhance the environment. This is why you see a lot of dialogue. There's even institutions being created to ensure the development of the private sector is on course. With the PPDF, there's various institutions along those lines. We avail ourselves. You talk about my interactions with people, my visibility. It's because we want to get to know entrepreneurs a lot more. This is why you see a lot more interaction. And the last point I'll make here is that, on account of what we're talking about, developing entrepreneurs and Zambian excellence and building Zambian millionaires, every time I go to a large-scale investor or investment, whether it be Mopani, whether it be the Wansha mine, I always go and do a masterclass in the same community. The reason is I want to make a link between the two. A Zambian entrepreneur must know that he could tap into the supply chain that exists as a result of the investment that's coming through, which they have to take ownership in. It will not work if people are not stepping up. We have to be aggressive, and this is the message that we have.
Let's address the other elephant in the room, and probably the biggest at the moment is the aspect of the power deficit and the load shedding. We're almost, in certain areas, 14 to 16 hours, which means productivity has really reduced to almost 50% knocked off in a day.
Yes.
It slows our GDP projection. I think the numbers have already been worked downwards to almost 2%, somewhere around there. Some businesses downsizing, need to restructure. The kind of discontent on the ground is the fact that there's not so much being done to address this. There was an energy indaba. Not so much has been spoken about in terms of the outcomes. The president the other day was saying we're spending sleepless nights, but he's saying the local engineers have failed to provide a solution. Why have we failed to pull local minds, local efforts, and things like that? It seems you in State House are so confident only in your own corner to know that something is being done, but the people out there are not confident. They don't see it.
And this is why I'm here, to really share the reality, the facts on the ground. Some very difficult to share, but some should inspire hope. The reality is this is a combination of a lot of issues. One is that we should have over the years invested in climate resilient power infrastructure, but it takes a long time to build power infrastructure, and you have to remember this government has only been in place for just under 3 years. But with that being said, we are undergoing the worst drought in a generation. This drought really has affected our ability to generate electricity, so at least we understand the genesis of the problem. Now, the most important thing is the solution. The solution now sits in two key areas. One is making sure we have climate agnostic ways in which we generate power. Number one, we recognize we have an abundant sun. It's not going to be affected by lack of water. There's investments coming on stream with regards to that. You've not only seen the announcements, you've seen the power purchase agreements signed, but then now you're seeing a process where
Which ones in particular are you talking about?
You've got one from Sky Power, which is 1,000 megawatts, but not at one go. It all has to be phased, because you have to remember the grid has some vulnerabilities. You can't plug in 1,000 in one place from a solar perspective, because solar has a degree of volatility, because when cloud cover happens, when nightfall happens, the power rate goes down, so you need to have stability. So with that being said, there are areas in which you can only add 50, another area can add 100. So you've got all these sites that have been allocated to various entities. There's another from Mazda, which was announced a couple of years ago. Now, that also is progressing very quickly, and we will have boots on the ground. In fact, already they've been on site, they've been doing all the assessments. There's a lot of technical work that goes to develop a power station. And I must mention, every investment, every power infrastructure has a gestation period from the time you identify the opportunity to the time you raise the money to the time you get your, all the technical aspects in place and so on to execute the project. It does take time, and then construction, of course, is the most important aspect. So I talked about solar. Then we've got 2 wind projects. There's one happening in Masaiti, another one in Mazabuka. Then you've got a coal project in Mamba, which is an expansion of an existing coal-fired power plant, which will take it from 300 to 600 megawatts. So these are projects that are fast moving. In fact, solar is a significant quantum, but then also the base load is key, because in order for you to have a sustainable power system, you need to be able to have predictable, stable power, which is...
Just to write it there,
sure.
I mean, power for any economy will be a very important component to drive growth, because even as you talk about increase in productivity on the mines and the mines, the new investments, you talk about sinking of new shafts, they require power.
Absolutely.
And will they depend on the same capacity? So how are we also planning to mitigate the immediate crisis, but also looking into being resilient? Tanzania, surprisingly, finds itself in excess power than ever. Our friends in Ethiopia, they fought with the Egyptians on damming of the Nile River, but they are energy sufficient.
Absolutely.
So how are our friends getting it right?
You have to remember, how long did it take to build the Renaissance Dam, which is exactly what you're referring to in terms of Ethiopia? We're talking about 7 to 10 years. Now, right now, with the government that's been in place for just under 3 years. So even when we talk about not getting it right, and I have to make this point, when we build infrastructure, we have to build it for the long run, even beyond the tenure of office that we have. So it's important to think long term and do things that benefit future generations, including if it means doing a 15-year project, but knowing that it will secure our power infrastructure for the next 50 years. This is very important. Now, the point I wanted to quickly just touch on is the fact that mitigation is coming from what I've shared already. The Mamba expansion, the solar.
So are these all upstream projects that will mitigate in the shortest possible time?
Not immediately. The solar, which will start to, you start to see more commissionings taking place. You've seen that we already just a few months ago at Itimpi, where there was a 60 megawatt solar power plant coming from CC. There's an expansion already actively moving. I think they'll take it beyond 120. So there's those projects, and you hear there's I think in the next couple of months there's another solar, maybe I think it's about 100 megawatts coming on stream. There's quite a number that are coming. All that will mitigate. But also, what's also important is the fact that, and you've probably heard this, is that there are some innovations that should address matters in a much shorter run. For example, our biggest challenge in the Kafue and Kariba is hydrology. So the only way you can really enhance your capacity to generate electricity is if you build infrastructure that gets water from where water is abundant to where there's a shortage, and that is from Lapula coming to the Kafue. That is actively being looked at with technical assessments and all of that. And of course, the parties who are looking at that see that it's feasible. So that's a work in progress.
So the president in the last few days has been saying, let's not protest. I think that was the headline I saw in the Daily Mail. Don't protest over power. We have just cracked a solution because we met the Chinese, or we've not been sleeping on this. Does the president know that some of us don't sleep because we don't know what to do next with the high cost of doing business and so on?
Sure.
Is this when he started waking up and not sleeping to these problems?
No, look, you have to remember that, in fact, some of the challenges that he found were much more significant than what you're seeing. Of course, the power situation is affecting every citizen. We know, look, we're not blind to the reality that business is actually struggling. I mean, having no power, like you said, it affects productivity, affects the ability of a business to carry out its obligations. So that's a reality we have to contend with. And of course, there's short-term solutions. Of course, there's a supplementary budget that was recently done to address areas where we can mitigate. And also really looking at the fact that this power deficit, as a result of the drought, is also creating a food security problem, which also means that we have to now seek resources to ensure that we have enough food for people, so that we don't want people to starve. Nobody should go hungry. So you have to realize that with leadership being in place, is that it's truly a leadership for the times, or a leadership in crisis. Because we have to recognize that in a crisis, this is when people truly have to rise to the occasion. And that God knows what will happen if we don't have a leader like him. And he's definitely on top of things. And you'll see, this power deficit will be a thing of the past. And we know that in the years to come, future droughts will not affect us, because we have such agnostic power systems that are not impacted by these other elements. And also climate smart agriculture.
Finally, Jito, you have really bootstrapped onto the ground and gone far and wide across this country. You were in Mamba last week. You've been as far as northwestern to Mingomba. You've been to FQM and visiting all these projects. I see you on bicycles in Chipata, desk making and all these things, and doing master classes with marketeers, meeting bus drivers, taxi drivers, and all that. Commendable. You report into the head of state.
Correct.
The public outcry or perception is that this president spends enough attention on international relations and international travel and really is detached to the grassroots and to the ground. You've been onto the ground. Do you tell your boss what the pain points are on the ground? And is President HH really aloof to the sufferings of the Zambian people? Is he a detached president?
He is very plugged in. He's one of the most accessible leaders that I've ever come across. The manner in which he interacts with people on the ground. The one thing that I believe we're not doing well enough is the communication aspect. This is why he's challenged us as his team, not just the advisory team, but also cabinet and government institutions, that we need to be better at communicating. This is why I have decided to essentially ensure this coverage of everything I do, and I believe that the coverage of his interactions with people is not that sufficient. We need to elevate it because he does interact.
Are you telling your boss what the people are telling you?
He's well aware.
What are the people telling you?
The fact of the matter is, the fact is clear. Issues of cost of living, issues of electricity, issues of all these are real issues.
And you're telling him
that he's well aware. And I'm not the only source. He's got multiple sources. He's got entire apparatus, institutions that keep him well aware of what's happening. But he does address it. You see, the fact of the matter is, it's one thing to be made aware and another thing to act on it. There's a reason why you've got so much. You see, to unlock and create change in an entire economy in a town, revamping Rwansha requires you to be smart, to focus on getting the mind going. So there he's doing that, and people's lives are essentially in the process of changing in a significant way. I've already seen it. I've felt the change in Kitwe already. The amount of agricultural investment that's coming in is going to be significant, not only from the private sector. There's definitely great support from the World Bank. There's also efforts being made, led by the Ministry of Agriculture. So that is well aware. You see, the issue here is we have to engage more. We need to manage expectations. People have to understand the reality, that we understand the issues, and the care is there, the heart is there. This is why our hope is that CDF, you see, when we bequeath, when we provide the financing to the communities, to the constituencies, to make decisions around what makes their lives better, the expectation is that the local leadership is doing that. So his connection to the people, in fact, if anything, what we are very proud of is the fact that this government has been able to decentralize the manner in which local communities are having to be dependent on central government, because now they've been given the powers of procurement, the empowerment as well. That's very significant. That is one of many reasons one can answer with confidence that he's very attached, he's very aware. This is one of the most hardworking presidents that this country has ever had in terms of, and we have to also be proud. Let's not make no mistake. Every time he travels, there's value that comes back. Had he not gone to China, I shudder to think what would have happened in Rwansha. I shudder to think what would have happened in Chambishi and Kalurushi. If he hadn't traveled to the UAE, I shudder to think what would have happened in Kitwe with Mopani. And all the other engagements he's had has unlocked billions of dollars of value. It does take time before the manifestation of those investments lead into someone's life changing, but that is something that we can be hopeful for, that people's lives will begin to change in a very significant way.
Jito Kayumba, thank you so much for coming through.
I'm grateful. Thank you.
My guest this evening, the Special Assistant to the President in charge of Economic Affairs and Development, Jito Kayumba. That wraps up this week's edition of Costa. Remember to catch the repeat episodes Mondays at 9:30 on Diamond TV, as well as on our Facebook page, Diamond TV Zambia, also on YouTube. Good night and have a fantastic evening.
Costa was brought to you by FQM Trident Limited, a subsidiary of First Quantum Minerals Limited.